So now we begin the final module of Unit 2 on supply and demand. In the last module, Module 8, we learned that sometimes the government intervenes in a market economy to control prices. And when they intervene to control prices, they are trying to either give favor to consumers or to producers because they believe that the market price is unfair to either group. And usually that's done for political pressure. Well, in this final module of the unit, we are going to see that not only does the government sometimes intervene to control the price of a product, but sometimes the government can intervene to control the quantity of a product. And so in this module, we examine these quantity controls and learn how the government uses them. So in this module, I will begin by describing how quantity controls create problems that can make a market inefficient. Just like price controls can create problems leading to inefficiency, quantity controls on the part of the government can also lead to inefficiency problems. And just like there were winners and losers with price controls, we will look at and explain who benefits and who loses from quantity controls in the market when the government chooses to intervene in this way. So, why would the government control quantities? Well, as I said, in addition to controlling prices, the government can also decide that the equilibrium quantity is for some reason too high, that too much of a good or service is being produced at the current market price. So the government then would determine a quantity control, or what we call a quota, which would be an upper limit or a maximum amount on the quantity of some good or service that can be bought or sold. And that limit would be below the market equilibrium quantity. So the total amount of the good that could be legally transacted would be called the quota limit. Now, think about this for a second. Why would we want to limit the quantity of a good that can be bought or sold? Can you think of any production that is limited? Who would benefit from limits on quantity controls? Well, a quota is set, a license is given or auctioned to producers, and a license from the government gives an owner of the license the right to supply a particular quantity of the good. But if you don't have a license, then you are not allowed to produce the good or service. And so in this way, the government is able to set a quota on the quantity of a good that is produced and limit its production. A good example of this would be fishing limits. Because the government might be concerned that the seas are being overfished and that if we catch too many fish from the sea, eventually they will become extinct and we will run out of fish. The government may wish to limit the number of fish that are actually caught in the sea. And if they do that, they're limiting the supply of a good, they're reducing the quantity of it, and so this would be called a quota, and a limit on quantity. Think about our depleted ocean fisheries or fishing seasons that have been completely closed to protect a stock of a species like salmon or swordfish or lobster, things like that. So keep in mind a couple of things before we move on. When we talk about the demand price, we're talking about the quantity, the demand price of a given quantity, we should say, is the price at which consumers will demand a particular quantity of a good. And the supply price of a given quantity is the price at which producers will supply that quantity. Those terms will come in handy as we look at these quotas. So, suppose we consider the market for taxis, okay? When we have a quantity control, or quota, it drives what we call a wedge between the demand price and the supply price of a good at that quantity. Think of it as the vertical difference between the demand curve and the supply curve, as opposed to the horizontal difference between the demand and supply curve that we looked at when we looked at price controls. So what ends up happening when the government creates this quota and drives a wedge between the price and the demand price and the supply price of a good is that the price paid by buyers ends up being higher than the price that is received by sellers. And so the vertical difference between the demand price and the supply price at the quota limit is what we call the quota rent. And that is the amount of money that a person would be willing to pay to get a license or rent a license from the government to be able to provide that particular good or service. This is done in many cities. An example here would be New York City, but many cities, even Denver and other cities, do this. They require taxi drivers to get a license to provide taxi service to the public. And if you don't have a license, you're not allowed to provide taxi service, and in that way, the government can limit the number of licenses for taxis that are given, and they can limit the number of taxi rides. And so when you buy one of these licenses, you are paying the government essentially this quota rent to rent the license, and that would be the maximum amount that a cab company would be willing to pay to get one of those licenses. So let's look at the market for taxi rides in the absence of government controls. Okay. In the absence of government controls, here's our demand schedule, and from that we draw our demand curve. And then we have our supply schedule, and we draw our supply curve. And we graph them, and we can see that in the absence of any government control of the quantity, that the market equilibrium quantity of taxi rides provided per year would be 10 million taxi rides provided per year at a price of $5 per ride. But then the government decides that they want to limit the number of taxi rides. They decide that 10 million rides per year is too many. So now we draw our supply and demand curve. We have our market equilibrium. We can see what we saw before. But now the government puts in the quota. A quota must always be to the left of market equilibrium. A quota set up, to the right of equilibrium will have no effect, because the equilibrium quantity is the greatest quantity that will be provided at that particular price. And so if that's 10 million rides, if you set a quota limit at 11, 12, 13 million rides, those wouldn't be provided anyway. So a quota limit only has an effect if it is a limit that is below the equilibrium quantity. That means it's to the left of it. So we draw a vertical line at 8 million rides a year. We assume that the government says that 10 million is too many. We only want 8 million rides per year to be offered, and so we're going to put a legal limit on that. And so we draw a vertical line at 8 million rides, and that is called our quota. Now, you'll notice that several things are true when we do this, okay? And that is that the demand price is the price at which consumers will demand that quantity. So at equilibrium, that's point E, but at the quota limit, the demand price is now point A, because we move up the demand curve and we find that there are people that are willing to pay more than $5 for a taxi ride. There are people that are willing to pay $6 or more. But that number is smaller than the number of people that would be willing to pay $5 for a ride. And so there are 8 million people that would be willing to pay $6 for a taxi ride. And so that's the quantity demanded at the quota limit and the price that they would be willing to pay. But there is another thing that is true for sellers. Okay? The supply price is the price at which producers will supply that quantity. And so there are only, if the limit is 8 million, then there are only 8 million cab drivers that are willing, or cab driver owners that are willing to supply rides, at this lower price of $4. And so if the limit is $4, you can, if the limit is 8 million rides, then there are 8 million that would be provided at a price of $4. Because remember, when at that limit, there are some taxi cab drivers that can't afford to provide a ride at a price lower than $5 a ride. So we find that the quantity supplied at 8 million, the quantity price would be $4. So now we have a quantity control, or quota, which drives a wedge between the demand price and the supply price. Well, what is that wedge? It's the distance between point A on the demand curve and point B on the supply curve. It's the vertical distance between the demand and supply curves. That's called the wedge. So suppose at the quota of 8 million, the demand price is $6, the supply price is now $4. So if buyers are willing to pay $6, but sellers can produce at a cost of $4, each owner of a license to offer a taxi ride would earn the difference of $2. And this is the amount that any taxi cab driver would pay to have a license. So quota rent is the difference between the demand and the supply price, the earnings that accrue to the license holder from ownership of the right to sell the good. It is equal to the market price of the license when the licenses are traded. We can also think of the quota rent as the opportunity cost the holder of the license bears for not renting out his license to another producer. Now, as we said, this quota rent is referred to as the wedge. It drives the wedge between the demand price and the supply price. And there is this shaded triangle that is being labeled here as deadweight loss. Now, what does that mean? Well, deadweight loss is one of the negative consequences of government quantity controls. And it's the area of this triangle that is triangle ABE in this particular case. And you should be able to recognize a triangle of deadweight loss. And if you had to draw this graph on your own, sometimes on tests and on the AP exam, you're asked to draw this graph and then to shade the area of deadweight loss. Now, how do you know what the area of deadweight loss is? Well, you begin at the market equilibrium price, which is point E, and you shade the area of the triangle that goes out to the quota, which is the distance between point A and B. And the area of that triangle is the area of deadweight loss. Now, why do we say this is deadweight loss? Well, because this is a form of inefficiency based on quantity controls. The inefficiency that results here is inefficiency in the form of mutually beneficial transactions that don't occur. Anytime the demand price at a given quantity is not equal to the supply price at that quantity, there will be missed opportunities. Okay? If you go along the demand curve between point E and point A, you find all of these buyers that are willing to pay more than $5 for a taxi ride, but less than $6 for a taxi ride. So at a price of $6, they won't get a taxi ride, but at $5 they would. If you go along the supply curve between point E and point B, these are all sellers that are unwilling to sell a taxi ride for $4, but they would provide a taxi ride for more than $4 up to $5. So they don't sell a taxi ride. But all of the buyers between A and E are willing to pay more for the taxi ride than what it costs all of the sellers between B and E. But because of the quota, these mutually beneficial transactions don't occur. These buyers are willing to pay more than what it costs these sellers to provide it. So the sellers would win by selling to those buyers, and the buyers would win by buying from those sellers, because the sellers would receive more money from these buyers than what it cost them, and the buyers would be paying less than what they would be willing to pay. So these are mutually beneficial transactions that don't occur because of the quantity, and we have a name for this. We call this deadweight loss because of the quantity control. So deadweight loss occurs because some of these mutually beneficial transactions that would benefit both the buyer and seller are prevented from occurring. A deadweight loss occurs, and we'll see this at other times in the course. We're not just going to see it now, it will come up again at many other times in the course. So you need to understand this concept and how to graph it, how to shade it on a graph if you have to draw it, or how to recognize it on a graph if it's drawn for you. And what you should know is that a deadweight loss occurs when a market is not perfectly competitive. Right now, in this unit, we are assuming perfectly competitive markets, and I described what that meant at the beginning of the unit. But in future units, we're going to look at markets that are not perfectly competitive, and any market that is not perfectly competitive has deadweight loss in it. And those are mutually beneficial transactions that don't occur, that society loses out on. And so that is seen as being inefficient and a loss to society. And so the price is greater and the quantity is lower than in a perfectly competitive market structure when deadweight loss occurs. So we talked about fisheries before, and some of this we can look at when we look at a story about the clams of New Jersey. Back in the 1980s, because there was excessive fishing going on the eastern seaboard, it threatened to wipe out New Jersey's clam beds. So the government wanted to intervene and step in to save these clams so that we wouldn't run out of them. And so the U.S. government introduced a clam quota. This set an overall limit on the number of bushels of clams that fishermen could catch, and it allocated licenses to owners of fishing boats based on their historical catches. And in order to be able to fish for clams, you had to have one of these licenses. Before I summarize, let me mention one other cost of a quantity control. We mentioned the inefficiencies that can result, but just like with price controls, there can be incentives for illegal activities in a black market as well, right? Because there are buyers and sellers that are prevented from getting mutually beneficial transactions, and they might try to get those transactions in the black market. Suppliers know that additional units could be supplied, and they could find buyers that are willing to pay more than it costs them to produce them. And so they could overproduce. But this kind of overproduction would violate the quota. In the fishing example, this would be known as illegal fishing or poaching. And so sometimes these illegal activities can occur when there are government quantity controls. Just as we saw in the last module, the black market can arise when there are price controls. And so there can be negative effects in the market with quantity controls as well. So what have we learned in this module? In Module 9, the final module of this unit, we've learned that quantity controls, or quotas, limit the quantity of a good that can be bought or sold. The quantity that is allowed for sale legally is known as the quota limit. But economists say that this quota then drives a wedge between the demand price and the supply price at the quota limit. And that wedge becomes known as the quota rent. It's the amount that sellers would be willing to pay to receive a license, or the extra amount they receive from what it costs them to supply the good at that particular price. But when we have these quantity controls, it can lead to several problems. One, of course, is deadweight loss, and that creates inefficiencies, and it can lead to illegal activities. This completes our look at Module 9 on quantity controls, and also completes the last module of Unit 2 on supply and demand. In the next unit, we go into the specifics of microeconomics. In the first two units, we've established the foundation for our understanding of economics as a whole.